Similarly, with the universality of the essence, that is, with the determination of the content by pure consciousness, conscience, when it proceeds to action, enters into relation with the many aspects of the case. The case breaks up into its various separate parts, and so too does the relation of pure consciousness to it, with the result that the manifold nature of the case becomes a multiplicity of duties. Conscience knows that it has to choose between them and to make a decision, for none of them in its specific character or in its content is absolute. Only pure duty is that. But this abstraction of pure duty has attained in its reality the significance of the self-conscious I. The self-certain spirit rests qua conscience within itself, and its real universality or its duty lies in its pure conviction of duty. This pure conviction is as such empty as pure duty, is pure in the sense that there's nothing in it, no specific content that is a duty. But action is called for. Something must be determined by the individual, and the self-certain spirit in which the in itself has attained the significance of the self-conscious I knows that it has this determination and content in the immediate certainty of itself. This, as a determination and content, is the natural consciousness, that is, impulses and inclinations. Conscience does not recognize the absoluteness of any content, for it is the absolute negativity of everything determinate. It determines from its own self. But the sphere of the self into which falls the determinateness as such is the so-called sense nature. To have a content taken from the immediate certainty of itself means that it has nothing to draw on but sense nature. Everything that in previous forms of experience presented itself as good or bad, as law and right, is something other than the immediate certainty of self. It is a universal, which is now a being for another. Or, looked at from another aspect, it is an object which, while mediating consciousness with itself, comes between consciousness and its own truth. So that instead of the object being the immediacy of consciousness, it rather cuts consciousness off from itself. For conscience, however, self-certainty is the pure immediate truth, and this truth is thus its immediate certainty of self conceived as content. That is, this truth is in general the caprice of the individual and the contingency of his unconscious natural being, his sense nature. There is quite a bit going on here in paragraph 643. We're looking at how this form of consciousness that Hegel calls conscience is developing itself. And you notice that one of the things running throughout this entire section, this last part of morality, before we start getting into some of the really cool shapes like, the beautiful soul and, evil and its forgiveness and all of that sort of stuff, is the problematic of conscience itself. We've seen this play itself out at several points in the dialectic earlier on in the phenomenology, where you have something that is, you might say, putting itself forward as a universal, and in the face of other universals. In this case, it's the individual consciousness that has a conscience who is engaging in what it believes to be moral action. And it's judging that moral action by conscience in the face of other things. And so Hegel wants to say here, as he's going to do by the end of it, for conscience, self-certainty is the pure immediate truth, and this truth is its immediate certainty of self conceived as content. Now, anytime that we're seeing immediacy, self-certainty, anything like that, we should already be, you might say, dialectically on our guard. You know that Hegel is going to show that there's more involved there, and that this truth that we're seeing of self-certainty is not really going to be self-certain. There's going to be a problem once we start untangling it. And there's quite a complex problematic already here in this section. So let's dive in. He says, with the universality of the essence, the determination of the content, the Inhalt, by pure consciousness, it goes similarly as it does for what he's just talked about. So we might back up a little bit into the previous paragraph where he talks about this acquaintance with and weighing all the circumstances, existing only as a moment, something which is only for others and it's incomplete. So the universality of the essence now is the other side of that he's looking at. That is also going to be, to some degree, incomplete. What does that mean to say that it's incomplete? It means that it's, as Hegel, in his terminology, it's a moment among a whole bunch of connected moments. It's not the entire show. It's not the one thing that determines and drives everything else. Instead, they're mutually determining. And, if you think about it as a little bit of a digression, if you think about how it actually works out for us in the decisions that we make, where we do, in fact, consult something like what we're calling conscience here. Hegel doesn't mean conscience, by the way, as that little still voice in the back of the head or the angel sitting on your shoulder as opposed to the devil or anything quite so formulaic or imaginary. He means that there's a sort of sifting out on the part of the individual who actually wants to fulfill their duties, their Pflichte in German, right? Their obligations, and doesn't quite have them all sorted out in what they are and has to rely on something that isn't going to be pure intuition or pure feeling, but can argue for itself in some ways. Maybe in ways that not everybody else can necessarily buy into unless they have certain experiences or certain insights, but certainly to some degree. So let's go on with this. Now, that was just sort of a teaser to get into it. Let's talk about what's actually happening in this section. So he says, conscience, when it proceeds to action, enters into relation with the many aspects of the case. And this is not an unfamiliar schema, right? So we have conscience as a particular gestalt, a particular shape of consciousness here in the morality section. It's engaging in action or comportment or behavior, handeln, right? And then what is action always applied to? Particulars. You don't act in a purely general way, because if you do, you never actually act. You have to act on particulars. And so those particulars, they comprise what we call here the case, the Fall in German. The situation would be another way of translating it, which makes it sound a little bit more existentialist, when we talk about, choosing in the situation or something like that. But that's really the way it works. I don't decide what I'm going to do about my children and whether to, have them here over fall break, despite the fact that it will, require me to engage in a lot of driving and, I have to reorganize my schedule. But it's good for them to be up here and spend some time engaging in things together and bonding and all of that sort of. That's a specific case, right? I could say more generally, well, what about children and spending time with their parents when they live at a distance? Now it's a bit more universal. It's a bit more general, right? And we could generalize it up the line, children spending time with parents. And now we've lost some of the specificity of it, right? The taking out the at a distance, we've turned it into something that's rather generic and purports to be universal, but is lacking in what Hegel here is calling content, right? So a specific case is where we actually do our acting. I drive down and pick up those kids and bring them back here, and we have particular conversations and particular interactions, even perhaps particular disagreements and meltdowns and fights that then we have to work through in particular ways so that they can learn the right lesson or not learn the right lesson, right? All of those are what we call the multiple aspects of the case. Here's where it starts to become really interesting. And again, not something radically new that Hegel's bringing up here. He's discussed this a number of times. But the case breaks up into its various separate parts. Those separate parts are parts of the totality that is the case. And skipping ahead a little bit into the next paragraph, I just want to, you might say telegraph or foreshadow a bit. Each of those parts can be emphasized on its own as being what's really essential to the case. And very often when we get into conflicts with each other about what actually happened, it's because people are seizing upon different aspects and saying that's what's really essential, and somebody over here is saying, no, you've got it wrong. This is what is really essential to the case. So, that's something good to keep in mind as we move forward. Here's what Hegel has to say. He says the case breaks up into its separate parts, and so too does the relation of pure consciousness to it. Why? Because it is breaking the manifold nature of the case into a multiplicity of duties. Again, when we get to specific cases, there are a whole set of duties that are involved in it. So, if I take, for example, driving down to get my kids for their fall break and, hanging out with them over the course of a weekend and then getting them back, right? There's several different duties involved there. Some of them are things that would be the case for any time that the kids are here, like feeding them and, actually interacting with them as a parent. Obviously, if they come up here and I say, okay, you're on your own, there's your place to sleep, enjoy yourself, and then I'm like, see you later, I got to go to London for a conference or something like that. I'm not fulfilling a duty, and that's a particular duty. I should be there. I should be engaged with them. I should act as a parent, driving down to pick them up. If I'm there on time, I'm fulfilling my duty. Maybe traffic is bad, and it takes me an extra hour to get there. Well, I didn't fulfill my duty to be there at that time. There's a multiplicity of different duties. And, interestingly, if we fulfill some or don't fulfill some all the way, that may give rise to yet other duties. You get into a big fight, well, now you have a duty to fix that fight, right? You have a duty to figure out what went wrong and put things back, as we say, on the proverbial rails and reconcile and all of those sorts of things. So any concrete action that we're engaging in within a real life situation is going to not only have a multiplicity of aspects, it's going to have a multiplicity of duties, a manifold, if you like, or a folding out into a number of different things. Sometimes we're taken by surprise, aren't we? We're like, holy crap, I had no idea that this job entailed quite so much, I'll give you another great example. Every time that I take on a class with a new institution, they say, hey, we want you to teach ethics for us, or, teach some business ethics, or teach some intro to philosophy. And I'm like, well, okay, how much does it pay? And how many students am I going to have? And what's your course management system? And when do you want it done by? And we're like, oh, okay, this all works out. And then I sign a contract, or, sometimes agree to a contract in the online setting. And then we get down to the nitty-gritty, right? It turns out that you can't upload things the way that you'd like to. So the videos have to be reprocessed and uploaded in this way. And, the grading system doesn't work the way it's supposed to be. And then all these extra emails come out from administrators saying, we want this from you, we want this from you, we want this from you. And then you get the students with the accommodations, where some of them are like, I have to have this accommodation made for me. And you've got now a whole bunch of extra duties that you didn't really realize that you were getting in for. As a matter of fact, most things in life are like that, aren't they? So, going back to Hegel once again, Hegel tells us that conscience, here's why there's an issue here. Conscience knows that it has to choose between these duties and to make a decision. So it has to engage in Wählen, selection, or you might say valuation of one thing against another, prioritization, and decision, entscheiden, splitting them apart, literally, and saying, this is what we're going to do, this takes lower priority. So, Hegel then says, why? None of them, in its specific character and its content, is absolute. Only pure duty is absolute. So anytime that we have decided that one specific thing in the case is going to be treated as if it's absolute, as if it's the most important, that's on us. We bear responsibility for it. That's not just something that comes down from on high and, the voice of the Lord says, in all these manifold aspects of the case, this is the one that matters the most, right? Make sure that you keep the table clean or something like that. And people sometimes go very wrong with these, don't they, in selecting the wrong things. For example, as a professor, I might be really, really interested in my duty of making sure that all of the students get to study Aristotle. Well, that's good in the class, but that's not the only thing the class is about. And if I prioritize that wrongly as the pure or absolute duty, I might be leaving out all sorts of other things as well. So conscience, that it is responsible for this. Conscience has to choose between these. Now, here's where we get to another conflict. He says, this abstraction of pure duty has attained in its reality the significance of the self-conscious I, the I of conscience, right? The self-certain spirit rests as conscience in itself, and its real universality or its duty lies in its pure conviction, Überzeugung in German, of duty. It tells itself a story that it has this duty that is the most important, that is the pure duty, but it's really, it's deciding this for itself. Now, a little bit of a pause here. If this starts to sound rather existentialist, it's not because you're reading existentialism back into Hegel. It's because, as the French, readers of Hegel certainly recognized, there are a lot of existentialist moments within Hegel when you get down into the nitty-gritty. I know that people think, because they do this big picture philosophy that, Hegel was all about the universal and the existentialism is about the individual. Hegel's about both. So, coming back to this, what does he say? Pure conviction is as such as empty as pure duty. It's pure in the sense that there's nothing in it, no specific content that is a duty. That doesn't help you very much, right? So this feeling of, I've got this pure duty, I'm pure conviction, that only lasts for a while. And then you start saying, well, what is it I actually have to do? And then now we're back into the concrete. Actual action, we could say wirkliche Handeln if we wanted to. Action that is aimed at real things, at realities, Wirklichkeiten. So he goes on and says, action is called for, something must be determined by the individual, the self-certain spirit in which in itself has attained the significance of the self-conscious I knows that it has this determination and content in the immediate certainty of itself. Immediate certainty of itself. What does this immediate certainty look like? Here is where, we've got this pure conviction of duty, right? Up on top, a universal, but empty. Where do we get our self-certainty from? As individuals. As tangible, living human beings with bodies. Well, Hegel says that this as a determination, Bestimmtheit, right, and content, Inhalt, is the natural consciousness. And what is natural? Natural not just in the sense of, oh, well, that's human nature, people act like jerks or something like that. No, what is it to be natural in this respect? This is a very sort of Kantian way of looking at it here. It's our impulses and inclinations, or if you like, drives, Triebe, right? The things that are driving us towards something. Our sex drive, for example, our drive to eat, our drive to fit ourselves into a social hierarchy. All of these things are Triebe, right? If you want to get Freudian with it, the pleasure principle is one of those drives, right? And then the thanatos thing, whatever that happens to be, Freud kind of goes back and forth about that, is a drive. Inclinations, Neigungen, literally being inclined towards one thing or another. For example, one of my inclinations is to sleep in the morning. If I had my opportunities, I would schedule my work day so it began around 10 o'clock and sleep in until 8 or 9, then get up and have a leisurely breakfast, and then start getting on with the day, and maybe there's other inclinations that I have as well. As a physical being, I like exercise, but not too much of it, right? And then after exercise, I like to lay around and eat some stuff to replenish whatever it is that I've lost, and have some nice popsicles, to replenish, to cool down a bit, or whatever it's going to be, right? We have these drives and inclinations, every single one of us, and they're different, some of them, from each other. These give us, as he says, determination and content. Conscience, he says, does not recognize the absoluteness of any content. Why? Because conscience is negativity. It determines from its own self, but the sphere of the self into which falls the determinateness is the so-called sense nature. To have a content taken from the immediate certainty of itself means it has nothing to draw on but sense nature, which is only a part of who we are as human beings. So what is Hegel talking about here as sense nature? Another expression that you see is sensibility or sensuousness. It's essentially what we... I have to be a little bit careful here. It's not just what we have in common with the other non-rational animals, because even human sense nature is a bit different, precisely because we're not just animals. That rationality part, even if the rationality is not being used, is a little bit different. This is why Aristotle, in Politics, Book 1, says that the corruption of the best is actually the worst, right? But this is part of where we get our content from. So it could be expressed, for example, in action. Maybe my natural conscious impulses, the Triebe there, with respect to my children, are sort of fundamental affection for those who are like me, those who I've spent time with, those who in certain ways have their origin in me, right? That could be part of what's going on here. So then I seize on certain aspects of the case. But that's not enough to really be moral, is it? So he goes on and he says, everything that in previous forms of experience presented itself as good and bad, law, right, is something other than the immediate certainty of self. Something coming in from the outside, something imposing demands on us, which would include not just the moral law, but also the laws of the land. We view those as extrinsic to our own desires. Maybe somebody passes laws that conform to our desires, or we get in charge, right? But he goes on and he says, it's a universal which is now a being for another, or looked at from another aspect. It's an object which, while mediating consciousness with itself, comes between consciousness and its own truth, so that instead of the object being the immediacy of consciousness, it cuts consciousness off from itself. And then here we come back to the point that we began. For conscience, self-certainty is the pure immediate truth. This truth is its immediate certainty of self, conceived as content. This truth, and here's a thing we left out, is in general the caprice, the Willkür, right? The arbitrariness of the individual and the contingency of his unconscious natural being, that is the sense nature. So this does, towards the end, come to sound like Hegel's not being a Kantian, but at least retracing some of the steps that Kant would trace. But, other thinkers as well. We have to be on guard against a kind of particularism that comes out of our own sensed nature, our own individuality, our own bodily nature. And be careful that we're not simply substituting our own desires for actual duty. And we're placed in kind of a tricky spot, right? Because in order to ratify it as duty, conscience has to be able to say yes to it. If it's something that's merely coming in from the outside, then conscience has a harder time recognizing it as something that really does have a moral right to impose itself as morality upon us, right? So morality for Hegel has to come from within, from conscience, and it has to be something that we can be certain of, and it has to apply to real life situations. So we're in kind of a bind at the end of this paragraph, are we not?